I've worn this Rolex Turn-O-Graph every day for a month. I'll tell you what I liked about it and what I'd change. I'll tell you the things you'll only find out after wearing a watch over and over again, and I'll tell you why this watch changed my mind about Rolex. I'm Thomas Hendricks, this is Chronia 24, and this is the Rolex Turn-O-Graph reference 116264. Let's cover the basics first before getting into the nuances of wearing this watch day in and day out. Debuting a few months before the Submariner in 1953, the Turn-O-Graph was the first serially produced Rolex with a rotating bezel. The first reference, 6202, looks very similar to the Submariner 6204. Real heads will know that the Zeograph reference 3446 from 1937 was the first Rolex with a rotating bezel, but only a few examples are known to exist. You have 4, 5, and 6-digit references for the Turn-O-Graph, each representing a particular era for Rolex. This example is the 6-digit 116264, which ran between roughly 2004 to 2011. This model is also known as the Thunderbird due to its association with the US Air Force's Aerobatic Squadron. If you're searching for these on Chronia 24, it can be helpful to search for Turn-O-Graph and Thunderbird, since some people use the names interchangeably. Now let's talk about this watch in the metal. I've had it on loan for a month, and here's what I've noticed. We'll go through each aspect of the watch, covering what it does well and perhaps what it could do better. The 116264 is a handsome watch. The matte gray dial used here has more depth and more softness than a standard black dial. The faceted hour markers bring the dial to life and help with visibility at different angles. They also create a bit of an optical illusion. By sloping downwards towards the outer edges of the dial, it makes the minute track look sunken like the pipe hand dials found on earlier Datejusts. For the first week, I swore this was a pipe hand dial until I brought it in the loop for a closer look. The lume is what you'd expect for a watch that's more suited to the office than the ocean, and there's enough visibility for everyday activities. The only thing I'd change about the dial would be to eliminate the date window for better symmetry. Of course, this is entirely a personal vendetta I have against date windows. This watch is essentially a Datejust, and you can't exactly get rid of the date in a Datejust. Notice that it's not a roulette date wheel that alternates between black and red numerals for evens and odds. This one is all red all the time. The red seconds hand adds a nice dose of personality for what is otherwise a pretty unobtrusive watch. It's something you'll find only on this generation of the Turn-O-Graph, and it's really the only time Rolex has used a colored seconds hand outside of the Milgauss. The red accents on the date wheel and the dial text make the seconds hand feel more cohesive and less random. The faceted hour and minute hands can disappear a bit in certain lighting conditions, but you'll always be able to see that flat white block of lume contrasting with the dial. I've never had any issue with reading the time on this watch over the last month. Let's touch on the crystal quickly before working outwards towards the bezel. The Cyclops magnifier is a signature part of Rolex design DNA. That said, I've always found the Cyclops counterproductive. You need to look at the watch at the perfect angle so the Cyclops doesn't distort the date beneath. It also captures light reflections, which can obscure part of the numerals. And because of the raised profile, it'll pick up scratches quicker than the rest of the crystal. It also interrupts the flow of what is otherwise a pretty balanced visual experience. Of course, this is not going to change the mind of any product designers at the brand. The Turn-O-Graph is largely the same as a Datejust, but with the added functionality of the rotating bezel. Although this is not a diving bezel because it glides smoothly in both directions. It's an enjoyable bezel to use, and there's the perfect amount of resistance as you glide it into place. That speaks to the build quality you'd expect from this brand. I do also enjoy that it glides silently. Many dive bezels, let's say the Tudor Pelagos for example, just rip, and you can hear it from across the room. That's understandable for a tool watch, but it's also nice to set the bezel without turning heads. With this generation of the Turn-O-Graph, you have a white gold fluted bezel. This dressier treatment does make the bezel more shiny, more reflective, and in this case, harder to read. You'll find yourself swirling your wrist for a second just trying to read the bezel, especially for the thin black 5-minute markings. That said, it helps the bezel markings blend in with the watch overall, making it at first glance look like a standard Datejust. And this can be a positive. The bezel markings are there when you need them, and they disappear when you don't. Part of me does wish there was an engine turned option like you see on earlier Turn-O-Graphs. Let's move on to the case. It measures 36 millimeters wide by approximately 12 millimeters thick and 45 lug to lug. The lug width here is 20 millimeters, so you can easily throw this on a leather strap, rubber strap, NATO strap, or whatever you like. The case is comfortable. It wears flat on the wrist, and there's a bit of nuance, although it's not made to be a particularly sculptural element. The only thing I'd change is to turn the case from polished to brushed. Between the fluted bezel, the polished case, and the sparkle of the Jubilee bracelet, the 116264 is a shiny watch. Personal preference, of course, and you'll get used to it either way, but I've personally always enjoyed the warm glow you get from brushed steel like you'd find on the Explorer. You'll often find this watch on an Oyster bracelet, but this one is on the Jubilee. And not just that, it's what's known as a Super Jubilee with a hidden clasp for an uninterrupted pattern wrapping around the wrist. These Super Jubilee bracelets were only made for a few years in the mid-2000s. The current generation Jubilee bracelet features a more secure and more easily adjustable Oyster clasp. The bracelet is comfortable, it's breathable, and again, when you snap the clasp shut, you're reminded of that Rolex build quality that's such a big part of their reputation. The only inconvenience about the Jubilee is that it has a tendency to stretch over time, and the crown emblem on this clasp is great for sliding your finger under, but it can get caught on fabrics from time to time. Lastly, the watch is powered by the caliber 3135, which is the same bulletproof movement used in the Datejust and the Submariner dates of the era. It's tough, it's accurate, it's easy to repair. I wouldn't change a thing. Let's touch on some of the competing watches you'll want to consider if you're in the market for a watch like this. Then we'll hit some final takeaways on the Turn-O-Graph after a month on the wrist. The biggest competition for this watch will undoubtedly be the Rolex Datejust. The DNA of these watches is 95% the same, with the only difference being the Turn-O-Graph's rotating bezel and perhaps a couple aesthetic touches like the red seconds hand. With the standard Datejust, you trade the bezel functionality for more variety of bezels to choose from. Also, some people do not like the timing bezel because they feel it's out of place on an elegant watch like the Datejust. For some, it's the perfect combination of dress and sport, and for others, it feels confused, like the watch is moving in two directions at the same time. As with anything in life, it's a personal choice. If you want a watch in this size with a rotating bezel, your options are limited. However, you could consider the 37mm Tudor Black Bay 54 or the 36mm Omega Seamaster 300M with a white gold bezel, reference 2236650. They're sportier than the Turn-O-Graph and bring a little extra wrist presence while still being on the smaller side. Vintage Turn-O-Graphs are also an option if you like the model but don't love the modern execution. With vintage, you get more character, more patina, and some different design choices, including the less shiny and slightly sportier engine turn bezel. The only downside is that you trade away the modern conveniences like a better movement, modern lume, and a quick set date depending on the year. If you like this watch and want to time things, you could also consider the 36mm Tag Heuer Carrera reissue like the CS 3110, 3111, or 3113. They're faithful recreations of a mid-century classic, although a chronograph is a different beast than what we're discussing here. The Cartier Santos should always be in the conversation when it comes to Datejust competitors. There's no timing functionality, but you get a handsome and respectable everyday piece for the same price point. It's not as robust as a Datejust, or in this case, Turn-O-Graph, but I would argue it is a better looking watch. So what are my final takeaways after having this watch on loan for a month? Well, I've never considered myself a Rolex fanboy. They're undeniably respectable, but the modern iterations don't always offer a lot of character, and they're not exactly rare or unique. Still, this watch offers something a little more offbeat and funky compared to the typically buttoned up timepieces we see from the Crown. It also checks off every box in terms of a go anywhere, do anything watch. I've challenged myself to wear this watch every day for a month, but really, it wasn't a challenge. I wasn't sold on it in the beginning, but it became a buddy over the last 30 days. Whatever happened during the day, planned or spontaneous, this watch was ready to go and looking damn good the entire time. There's a lot to love and not a lot to get used to. Also, the build quality really is superb. I looked forward to all the ASMR moments of snapping the watch on, screwing down the crown, and gliding that buttery smooth bezel. As much as I hate to admit it, it does feel cool to wear a Rolex and be seen wearing a Rolex. That's not my primary motivation when choosing a watch, but I'm not complaining either. At roughly $8,000 to $9,000, it's not an inexpensive watch, but it does feel worth it. I can't say that my mind is set on picking one of these up in the future, but it certainly did change my mind over the last month on the wrist. I'm Thomas Hendricks with Chrono 24. What's your experience of modern Rolex and what do you think about this watch? Let me know in the comments below.